Hello, welcome all. I hope you can hear me. Welcome all again, and welcome to this first session of the course, A Fusion of Virtual and Physical Education Engagement and Practice through Digital Immersive Experience. We are still admitting the participants, so maybe we wait for a few seconds. Here we are. I start by reminding to the students at the affiliated universities, so Ca' Foscari, UAV, University of Bologna and Firenze, that to contact Fondazione Giorgio Cini to get the curricular credits. There will be more info in the Zoom chat. So you will get more information soon in the chat. Welcome again to A Fusion of Virtual and Physical. This course is curated by Factum Foundation. My name is Costanza Blaskovic, and together with Blanca Valbuena, I will introduce these 4 sessions, 2 today and the next tomorrow, dedicated to the potential of digital technologies for a fresh approach to education, blending entertainment with knowledge creation. Today, with Otolo, Haley Ramos, and Andre Jauregui, we will concentrate on the digitization of cultural and scientific heritage to provide dynamic and interactive access for education and research. Education is no longer given in school and universities only. The boundaries of institutions providing education exploded. Museums, libraries, archives, and in general cultural institutions tend to provide education in many ways. For sure, the spaces, virtual or physical, where we get to learn things are now almost infinite, in a sort of democratization of education, cultural fruition, art and science dissemination. Also, research got much more dynamic. Providing access to sources and context online is now a priority for most institutions. I will leave now the floor to Otolo. He's Senior 3D Recording Specialist at Factum Foundation. Our foundation is a not-for-profit based in Madrid, specialized in digital technologies for cultural heritage preservation and digital mediation. We engineer, develop, and create our own recording technologies for non-contact, high-resolution digitization of cultural heritage in 2D and 3D. And this is why today Otolo will concentrate on innovating imaging techniques applied to GLAM collections, recording, processing, dissemination tools to allow for new and deeper access and context to collections. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Constanza. Let me just share. So yes, this is going to be about sort of well, it's generally about recording for galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. But I wanted to focus on sort of the part of those collections that basically haven't really been recorded or haven't received much attention in terms of digitization until very recently. So as Costanza was saying,
Sorry,
Yes?
I interrupted now better than later. Your camera is off, and maybe you wanted to have it on. And since I interrupted you, for everybody listening, you can ask questions in the chat. We will probably answer at the end. Thank you very much, and sorry.
There we go. Sorry. Yeah. So as Costanza was saying, the sort of goal of the foundation is to record and disseminate cultural heritage through digitization. And usually what this has sort of meant for us is sort of how do we use this technology to basically change the way that people view cultural heritage. One of the most recent examples from just a few weeks ago, which I think illustrates this very well, is the Michelangelo Imperfect exhibition that was hosted at the SMK Museum in Copenhagen, which featured, I think it was 9 facsimiles of Michelangelo that were created from the 3D models that we've recorded across Italy and in Spain and America, uh, in order to create facsimiles for this exhibition. So in the image on the left here, you have the Michelangelo's Cupid, which is in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, that I scanned. And the image on the right features, they're actually not really in this view, but it features 3 facsimiles that we made from the tomb of Julius II, or the designed tomb of Julius II, which Michelangelo made through like over the course of his life, and 2 of them are in Rome, in San Pietro in Vincoli in Rome, and then one is in Florence, in the Palazzo Vecchio, in Florence. And basically, these have never been seen together before as a set. And so you're able to appreciate them in a completely different way, because as I said, he was making these over the course of decades of his life. And stylistically, they change quite dramatically. And you're only really able to appreciate this by seeing them all together. So it's a feature of the of how we can use new digital technologies in order to bring a different light onto these works of cultural heritage. Uh, sorry, there. So our remit spans across like all fields of 3D recording. So several years ago, we recorded the entire island of San Giorgio Maggiore in Venice, which is where Archive and the Cini Foundation are based. And we recorded the entire island with LiDAR, as well as doing photogrammetry on certain architectural elements in order to basically get an idea of the state of conservation of the island as a whole, and how, and as a tool to monitor, for example, the rising sea levels and how that affects the palace on San Giorgio Maggiore. Uh, we also employed the Lucida laser scanner as well as panoramic photography in order to record color. So we have a pretty complete recording of the entire island. And going forward, we're able to use that as a tool to compare with the state of the island as it is today compared to how it was while we recorded it during COVID, so about 5 years ago. Similarly, we have an initiative with the Western Libraries in Oxford University, where we've installed one of our newer scanning systems, the Selene photometric stereo scanner, to digitize and record elements of the Western Library in high resolution. So basically what this system allows you to do is it allows you to record up to a precision of 12 microns. That's a pixel resolution of 12 microns. And with this system, we're recording copper plates in the collection, as well as manuscripts and certain books and palimpsests, to basically analyze the minutiae of the details down to sort of, drops of ink on the paper, for example. So we've made quite a lot of very interesting discoveries on this in the Western libraries, where, we've found, or the researchers have found, rather, using our scanning system, sort of the first engravings by William Blake on the back of one of these copper plates. We've found sort of Anglo-Saxon signatures and things like that in the pages, which have long since disappeared to time, but are now being rediscovered. So systems like these present a really interesting capability to acquire new insights into collections that have previously gone unnoticed. And similarly, we also can use the same scanning system on physical objects as well. This is what I would call a 2.5D scanning system. So it's not a fully three-dimensional image, it's actually a depth map image, but you're able to get a staggeringly large amount of detail out of the images. And this will only increase as basically optics and camera technology goes along as well. So here for the camera equipment, we're basically using commercially available systems in order to extract this 3D data, and that's dependent on the lens, the individual lens and camera components that you acquire for the system. So one of the things that has gone largely unstudied in the same way are small objects and in particular insects collections. If anyone in the audience is squeamish about bugs, I apologize. There's a lot of them in this presentation. But basically, these have gone largely undocumented as a whole, and largely because they're pretty fundamentally unscannable objects in the traditional sense. So my own personal interest in this, it started based on the fact that I collect and play with Warhammer figurines, and I wanted to find a way to basically digitize my collection in order to play it, basically make a video game to play them with my friends over a network. So this was just a basic version that I created in Unreal Engine. But it's the same principle. Essentially, these figurines are tiny, and so scanning them is actually incredibly difficult. And it started me along the path of looking into how do I record in a meaningful sense these small objects. So you can record them in a very basic generic sense without too much difficulty. But what I'm really interested in is capturing very detailed 3D models of these objects in order to, for example, you can scale them up for an exhibition, or you can have a viewer in which people can study the 3D models in depth. So as I said before, the most scanning systems don't really have the capacity to scan small objects, or certainly beyond a certain size. And what I mean by that is sort of generally anything less than 10 centimeters in size. Those that can are generally more aimed at sort of the microscopic, which is too small. And the reason why is largely to do with the problems with scanning, with macro imaging in general. But for insects in particular, insects are not very scannable creatures because they have translucencies usually in the form of their wings. So the wings tend to be very transparent, which is fundamentally unscannable. And they tend to have, for example, like iridescent shells or something where viewer dependent, the color changes depending on which angle you're viewing it from. And as I discovered, they're typically quite hairy creatures, and hair is a real problem because it basically you can't mesh hair very reliably with traditional rendering methods. So I thought I'd quickly go over some of the more traditional scanning methods, kind of to elaborate on why they can't do these small images. So the first one is a very common one is a LiDAR scanner, which can't do small objects purely because it was designed for to do architecture. So basically, this system works by sending out lots of lasers, and as a time of flight system, it measures the time between the signal being sent out and being received back. And that's how it measures scale and distance. So this can't really be used for something that's about 5 centimeters big, for example. A sort of very typical system that we used to use in Factum a lot was the white light scanning system, which basically projects a pattern of light over an object, and then you have two cameras at 45-degree angles that measure the distortion in that pattern as a means of extracting the 3D data. And on a theoretical level, this basically can go down to a size as well as small as you can project the pattern. However, in practice, this system has a lot of flaws, namely that you're relying on two cameras at 45-degree angles, so oblique angles tend to get completely missed. But also you have because you have like a parallax between the two cameras, you tend to not be able to record something so small. Like it's a little bit like how if you look at something, put something very close to your face and try and look at it, you go cross-eyed. It's the same principle with this system. Uh, Similarly, this is a more modern version of the same thing. It's quite common now in the 3D scanning world is the Artex scanning system, which is essentially the same thing. It's just handheld, but it suffers from the same problems ultimately, which is namely a depth of field problem. Photogrammetry is the main system that we use these days because it's a highly portable system and we get very good results from it. You can actually record small objects with this scanning system, but the problem with photogrammetry mostly falls into the category that I was talking about with insects, which is that when you have viewer-dependent coloring and transparencies, those tend to not translate well into a 3D model. They tend to cause confusion or noise. So photogrammetry as a system, as a means of extracting a point cloud is great, but as a means of extracting a, a mesh, a structured mesh from the point cloud, it tends to be quite problematic when it comes to small objects. So on the other side of the scale, you have the scanning electron microscope. This is more akin to the sort of 2.5D systems that Factum has sort of made in the past in terms of that it's not actually producing a 3D model, it's producing a depth map image, a two-dimensional image with some three-dimensional information. And basically this also is quite I mean, it's humongous for a start, but you need to basically put your specimen within a vacuum chamber and then basically blast it with electrons, and that's how you get the information from the scanning system. So this leads to, as you can see in the example on the right, to highly detailed images. They don't tend to have color. So whenever you see a image from a scanning electron microscope which has color in it, that tends to be false color. So color that's been added in through whatever means, usually in Photoshop. And so that leads me onto the system, a very new method which I've been working with for the insects, which is Gaussian splatting, which is a very new technology in the field of computer graphics. So what is it? Because it doesn't fall within the realm of traditional rendering, because traditional rendering you typically are working with what's known as a triangulated mesh. So you have your point cloud, which is a series of points describing the geometry of the object, and then you vectorize those points to create a triangle, and that's how you describe in physical terms the surface of the object. In Gaussian splatting, you don't have that. It's kind of the best term I've heard used is it's a posh point cloud basically. So it's effectively a point cloud, but instead of representing the surface through points or through triangles, you're representing them through Gaussians. And to describe a little bit what Gaussian splatting is, I kind of have to cover neural radiance fields first, or NeRFs. This is kind of shows how quickly the technology is moving. So NeRFs sort of took the 3D graphics world by storm about 4 or 5 years ago. And basically this created this, it basically was a new field in computer graphics because like Gaussian splatting, it's not based on triangles or points. So what it does is it basically samples 2D images multiple 2D images, and it creates a sort of a neural network between those 2D images. And sort of if you imagine like a line going through, as this image demonstrates, basically sampling points along that line, it basically calculates whether there's nothing there, i.e. it's a transparency, or there's a color point there. And so you were able to get this photorealistic 3D scene, which it was very slow to render, but it looked absolutely incredible. The only problem is that every time you moved, it would have to recalculate everything. So as you moved, you had to re-render every angle of view again, which made it somewhat unwieldy and with somewhat limited application. Gaussian splatting is kind of halfway between NeRFs and traditional graphics. So it's somewhat closer to traditional graphics in that you're working with a point cloud. But at each point, instead of a singular point in space, you have a Gaussian. And it's called a Gaussian because, as from the graph, that's a typical Gaussian distribution in one dimension. If you extrapolate that to two dimensions, you basically have like a conical sort of hill kind of shape of varying intensity. And in 3D, you kind of, if you imagine like a sort of a blob that sort of fades out as you go towards the edges, that's a Gaussian. So by having millions of tiny Gaussians, you can construct not only the shape of the object, but you can also have viewer dependent color. So using spherical harmonics, you can determine the color from any given angle, and you end up with a photorealistic 3D model that you can fully articulate around. And I'm going to apologize for my seriously bad drawing in the next slide. But basically, this is kind of how it calculates it out. So I've taken like a sort of crescent shape or a banana or what have you, and basically you run it through the software, and you run it through thousands of training iterations. And what those training iterations do is they basically try and describe the shape in as few pieces as possible, and gradually increase the number of Gaussians till you have an accurate representation of the subject. So one of the main benefits of this is that you can record things that were previously unrecordable. So you can record transparencies like glass, for example, which I've done here. This is just a sort of quick 5-minute scan that I did in my living room. So it's a little bit sort of out of focus, and I didn't optimize it very well, but it kind of expresses the idea, which is that this is a scene that you can move around and that you can inspect. So for not just for small objects, but for any objects of, let's say, glassware, for example, or jewelry, you can suddenly have a way of 3D recording and sharing that information out in a very photorealistic way. So this I did in 5 minutes just with a video camera. Just to illustrate the point that you can scan glass and reflective surfaces. So this video that I've done here is a highly sped up sort of screen capture of the rendering process for the Gaussian splat, and it kind of illustrates or sums up what I've just been explaining. So we're starting here with the point cloud. And you can start to see so you can see the individual points in the point cloud, which I disable quite soon, in order that you can see the Gaussian splat. So basically you can see all of these little Gaussians sort of flying about. This is going over the course of this sort of 3-minute video, it's going to go through about 60,000 iterations in order to reach a more finalized state. So what it's doing is it's basically sampling and resampling where each Gaussian should go, sort of what color it should display, and so on and so forth. And this insect in particular was my main test subject in the process of figuring out how to record objects for insect collections. And so as it's built the geometry now then it sort of becomes a process of filling in the detail. And well, in this actual process took about 4 hours to complete, which I've condensed down into sort of 3 minutes. But basically, you start to slowly see details building up in the creature, so that you have like the hairs are starting to be rendered out so at first just as single Gaussians, and then they become slowly more refined over time until you get something that approaches a more photorealistic representation of the insect itself. I'm just going to move it along a little bit. So you start to see all of the sort of subtle markings on the surface of the shell, and all of the hairs sort of slowly coming into place on the legs. It sort of feels a little bit like how descriptions that people give of when, you know, they've had their eyesight restored to them, having previously lost it. The sort of the world is a sort of jumbled bunch of shapes that need time to take form, to make sense of. So it sort of feels a little bit like that. But what you end up with is a highly photorealistic um, subject that's much more realistic than the traditional rendering methods. So in the next slide, here we have, this is the finished Gaussian splat of the insect, and you'll notice things like the way that the shell changes color as you're moving around. This is an iridescent beetle after all, but also you can notice like all of the very fine structures of the individual hairs on the shell, which with traditional rendering methods, as I'll show in a second, is just not possible. You can also see like all of the individual sort of bits of dust that are on the object, which is one of the toughest obstacles for recording small objects, as I discovered, is that dust is something that you just can't really get rid of completely. So that's so on the right you have the Gaussian splats, and you can see all of the hair or the detail. The left is the photogrammetry from the same data set. So basically the same input images were used in both, um, for both the photogrammetry and the Gaussian splat. And the photogrammetry, you'll notice that the color is a lot flatter. That's because basically the color um, you can do spherical harmonics sort of in post processing, but basically the color on a photogrammetric recording is flat. It doesn't change. So it looks much flatter, and the way that the fine hairs basically end up, the way that triangulation works, you basically end up they sort of get clumped together into one solid mass as a mesh. So it's not, it doesn't, it's a nightmare. You have to clean that by hand basically. And if you're being faithful to the original, you have to remodel the hairs back in, which is a lot of work. And also you're then providing more of an interpretation rather than an actual recording of the subject in question. So there are downsides to Gaussian splatting. So the biggest one from our point of view is that you can't output the 3D data physically, at least not as a Gaussian splat. You can use the same data set to create a photogrammetric model, as I was saying, and then output that. But the Gaussian splat in and of itself it's just a point cloud. It's not physical in any way. So because it's also so new, this is only sort of 3 years old as a method. There aren't many ways of presenting it at the moment to the outside world. So it always looks great within the software itself, but then you export it as effectively as a point cloud file. And if you try and import it into something like Unreal, you have to go through a bunch of workarounds because Unreal's not really designed to host something like that. And then it tends to look not as good as it did in the original viewer. There are some web-based viewers that are that do a reasonably good job of displaying the model, but at the moment they're somewhat few and far between. So your options are quite limited, short of actually building it yourself. The processing programs themselves are still all in beta stage because, as I said, it's a brand new thing. And that means that your processing options are also quite limited. Um, so there are some web-based programs that do allow you to process a Gaussian splat, but you tend to lack a lot of control in the way that those handle the process itself. And also there's some questions about, how much ownership you really have over the resultant model through these web-based viewers. The There's also like this element where, as I said, your starting point for the Gaussian splat is a point cloud. And many of these programs are not that good at creating the point cloud. So you have to create the point cloud in a third-party software and then bring it into this software and run the process. Not all of them are quite so forgiving in um, in allowing you to do that. There's one or two that are very good, but on the whole, there it's still very much a work in progress. So Gaussian splatting is one thing, but the main challenge for recording these collections of small objects is really the fact that you're having to use macro photography. And macro photography requires a little bit of explanation because it's quite a misused term, especially on internet forums and so on. So this image would typically be called a macro photograph. In the very classical definition, it's not. So what macro means is traditionally is a one-to-one reproduction ratio of the object on the camera sensor. And as our baseline, we tend to use a full frame camera sensor. So as this demonstrates, an object that's 36 millimeters end to end will fill up the full frame sensor. And then you have 2-to-1, 5-to-1, etc. Going down towards sort of microscopic, which tends to start at around a 10-to-1 reproduction ratio. The reproduction ratio itself is somewhat sensor dependent. So full frame is our baseline because that's the industry standard, but sensor sizes come in a range of different sizes, and each of those will have their own one-to-one. So, for example, you have the most common form factors for sensors on the open market are full frame, which has which has a crop factor value of 1. And then APS-C, which has a crop factor value of 1.5, and Micro Four Thirds, which has a crop factor value of 2. So basically, what's a one-to-one reproduction ratio on a Micro Four Thirds sensor is effectively a 2-to-1 reproduction ratio on a full frame camera. And then going on down towards, you have an iPhone sensor there in the bottom right-hand corner. So what do I mean by crop factor? Crop factor means that if you have like a standard 50 millimeter lens on the camera body, that's going to be you times the crop factor by the focal length of the lens to get the equivalent focal length at that at the crop factor for the crop factor. So at full frame, this is a 50 millimeter image. For the APS-C, it's about it's times by 1.5, so about roughly a 75 millimeter equivalent focal length. And then Micro Four Thirds, it's a roughly 100 millimeter focal length. So basically, with the system that I've been putting in place to automate the process of doing the photography because it's very time consuming, so you need to automate it. I ended up going for a Micro Four Thirds camera because basically it actually gives you a bit more flexibility in the because of its crop factor. So this is basically with a Micro Four Thirds you can use smaller, more compact lenses, which you're able to then focus from further away to achieve a one-to-one reproduction ratio or an equivalent one-to-one reproduction ratio over the full frame. And the higher pixel density of a Micro Four Thirds sensor also works in its favor because you're basically able to capture more information on a smaller size. So um, it's an important sort of thing to note that sensor sizes don't have a linear relationship. So despite the fact that the Micro Four Thirds sensor is half the size of the full frame sensor, is not twice as bad. So here is an early example that I made of on the top you have a full frame one-to-one image of the beetle with 100% crop on the right, and then on the bottom you have a one-to-one reproduction on the Micro Four Thirds, again with 100% crop. And basically you're able to capture so much more detail on the Micro Four Thirds, and that's not just a function of the optics, that is also to do with the pixel density on the sensor itself. This is a sort of even clearer view where I have a direct comparison with the one-to-one on the full frame on the left, and on the right you have the equivalent one-to-one on the Micro Four Thirds system, and the difference in detail. There's a huge difference in detail between the two. So the Micro Four Thirds is able to much easier out resolve the full frame camera, which was somewhat an unexpected thing. The other benefit of using Micro Four Thirds is the fact that everything is times by two effectively. So the main problem with macro is that your depth of field is razor thin. And the reason why it's razor thin is because as you get closer to the subject, your depth of field becomes less and less. So with Micro Four Thirds, because you're working from slightly further away, and your aperture value is essentially doubled because of the crop factor, it means that you have a little bit more margin on the depth of field. So using this formula just to illustrate the depth of field problem at f8, an aperture of f8, which is sort of quite a closed down aperture. For those of you unfamiliar with photography terms, your aperture on the lens, the more closed it is, the higher the f number, and the larger your depth of field is. So at f8, which is quite a high f-stop, your depth of field is only 0.9 millimeters at 1-to-1, which is nothing. So you might ask, why don't you just put it to the maximum f number and therefore have the maximum depth of field? Well, there's a phenomenon known as lens diffraction, which is illustrated in the image up above, which is that basically the smaller the aperture, basically the light as it enters the lens gets dispersed, and that basically, rather than making the depth of field, it does make the depth of field larger, but it also makes everything less sharp. And this can be illustrated on what's called a modulus transfer function graph, or an MTF graph, which basically shows you the fall off in image quality as you go up in apertures. So this is actually the MTF chart of the lens, which I am using, which shows you that at f4 is where you get the sharpest image, and then by the time you get to f22, you've lost nearly half your image quality from the optimum, which is why I went for f8, which is because it's a sort of kind of like a happy medium between having a sharp image and a larger depth of field. So because you're dealing with such a small depth of field, you have to do something called focus stacking, which is basically where you take a whole sequence of images, moving the focal plane through the object, and basically stack all of those together, removing the out of focus parts and keeping the in focus parts. And that basically gives you a fully in focus image. It's a very common technique used in landscape photography, except in landscape photography, you're usually only having to take about 2 or 3 images in order to achieve a completely in focus image. In macro, you need to take a lot. So in this particular image there was around 32 images taken. And to do so, even on an automated system like this was, you still get some errors. So you need to account for an overlap between your focus planes. So in this particular image, it looks fine when you look at it as a whole, but when you zoom in, you can see that there are still out of focus areas, basically where those areas have been missed. So because of this, I decided to focus on basically trying to leave no room for error and instead extracting frames from a video file as you move the focal plane through the object. So rather than taking singular images, you just take one long video, extract all of those frames, and then focus stack those frames. I've missed a bit. This is an example of what happens when you use too small of an aperture, too large of an aperture. So when your aperture is at f4, i.e. when you're getting the sharpest image, your depth of field is too small, and so you basically end up with this sort of weird ghosting effect when you stack them. So these are 2 extracted frames from the video files. There's another benefit of using a micro four thirds system is that you can extract video frames at a full resolution. So my full frame camera has a 50 megapixel sensor and can record at 8K video. 8K video is roughly equivalent to about a 33 megapixel image, which means that you're losing a lot of resolution when you're recording video. Whereas with Micro Four Thirds, you can do what's called an open gate recording, where you are basically using all of the pixels on the sensor. So it's just as if you were taking a photograph effectively. So compiling all of these frames together from the video, I was able to get a perfectly focus stacked image across the entire object. And this was the base data set that I was using in the Gaussian splat video that I showed earlier. So basically these are the main data set that is used. So yeah, finally, as I was saying, the dust is really the main issue that I still have to contend with for this system. So I mean, it literally you can't leave the thing alone for more than 5 seconds without it accruing new dust. And it's true that I live in an apartment with a cat, which doesn't help. But basically, this whatever I did, like I couldn't get rid of it, and that's just something that there seems to be no real way around, short of putting it in a like through some sort of industrial process for cleaning, which is unrealistic when you're dealing with collections that are thousands, if not millions, of objects. So just to sum up, final slide, the basically 3D scanning small objects is incredibly difficult and time consuming, but because of the introduction of Gaussian splatting onto the game, there's a huge potential to basically record a whole bunch of objects that have thus far gone completely ignored in many collections around the world. Not just insects, but jewelry and figurines and what have you. Anything that wasn't previously scannable is suddenly scannable. So yeah, basically moving forward, we're looking at ways to bring Gaussian splatting to a sort of more general audience. There's one major benefit to Gaussian splatting that I actually have forgotten to mention, which is that it's computationally incredibly light to display. It takes a lot of computing power to process it, but once you have the model, it it requires almost nothing to run. It's very, very light, which means that really anyone with any computer, you don't need a special graphics card or anything to display the graphics properly. Really, it's something that anyone can run, which potentially can democratize the displaying of cultural heritage digitally in a completely new way. That's it. That's the end.
Thank you very much. Really interesting, and well, I knew what you were working on, and I really hope that we'll have news soon for new projects with these techniques. And there are some questions for you, Otto, already, and
Okay.
maybe might be useful to open the presentation or not, judge.
Okay.
So, for example, Rashmi asks if can you tell us the input images, the input data that you use for the first model of the bug you shared? And on that one, on the same example, which camera and lenses you used?
Could you repeat the first part of the question
Sure.
again?
One is the input data for this model.
Okay, so the input data, depending on where you start in the process, but purely for the Gaussian splat, the input data is essentially the focus stacked images. So there were for this model, I took about 300 independent stacks, and that was my input data. If you're starting the process just from like the input files, well, that's essentially 300 videos that you need to focus stack. And the second part of the question
And
was
the other question was
what equipment?
camera and lens. Yeah.
So yeah, the camera is a Panasonic G9 II. So that's just it's fairly recent, but a pretty standard video, well, sort of hybrid video photography camera. And the lens was the OM Systems 90mm macro.
And then about the softwares, because you mentioned two, and what are the software you used?
The what? Sorry?
The softwares.
Oh, the software. Sorry. So yeah. The focus stacking software was Helicon Focus 8, which is a fairly standard focus stacking software. It's slightly better, in my opinion, than Photoshop's own stacking capabilities. It's certainly faster. Then the point cloud I assembled in Reality Capture just because its feature detection and alignment works better. And then for the Gaussian splatting itself, I used it's free at the moment. It's called Post-Shot. And Post-Shot it's still in beta, so there's a lot of problems with it. But it's been the program that I found has produced the best results.
And then going ahead, what were the lenses used for the full frame and the M4 free
So
cameras?
the full frame I used a Canon 100mm macro and a Canon R5 body. Probably there's a better choice I could have chosen, but that's just the one that I use like day to day for Factum. So it's what I had available.
Mhm. And for the M4 cameras?
That's the one I said before. That's the Panasonic G9
That's the
II.
same. Okay. Great. Other questions? Which software you recommend to stack, but I think you just mentioned it.
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a lot of software that can do focus stacking. Helicon, it's not free, but it's, it's a pay once software, and it's not terribly expensive, and it delivers by far the best results in my opinion. Photoshop can do it, Lightroom can do it, DxO can do it, um, so can Capture One, I believe. But yeah, there's basically almost any photographic software will be able to do it to some level.
Oh, well, they asked for the spelling. You said Helicon.
Helicon,
Or,
Helicon.
and do you see other application for the method you are developing?
Yeah, so one of the things I've been playing around with quite a lot is trying to build environments using Gaussian splatting and then integrating 3D models into those environments. So essentially, if you can have like a high resolution 3D model within a photorealistic setting, that's a whole new way of presenting the data, because previously one of the problems is when you're building a virtual environment, you're dealing with you're having to contend with a polygon budget effectively, which means that you kind of have to decimate the polygon count way down for everything. But because Gaussian splatting is so computationally light, you can have an entire environment made from Gaussian splatting, which is, weighs nothing computationally to use. As I said, Unreal is not yet at the place where you can fully integrate Gaussian splats into a project, but I have no doubt that it's going to get there fairly quickly.
The chat is very dense now. Another question is, you said, this is just a confirmation, it's not possible to create a mesh from 3D Gaussian splatting data, or is it?
No, it is, but as I showed in the slide where I was this slide, so it's this is the same data set, but photograph because you have to have like a mesh, you need to create a mesh in order to sort of physically output the 3D model. Um, you basically then run into all the problems that photogrammetry generally has, because it's ultimately a photogrammetry data set that you're using to create the Gaussian splat. So at the moment, it's a limitation of Gaussian splatting, which I don't really see how that can be properly resolved. So if you were doing, say, a piece of like a piece of glass, for example, which photogrammetry definitely can't render because it's transparent, so it's got nothing to work with. That can't really be turned into a physical model. These insects kind of can, with the exceptions that this slide shows. But there's quite a lot of objects that you can record with Gaussian splatting that can't be replicated because things like transparency just can't be meshed.
Another question, to create a video walkthrough instead of reality capture, do you have any suggestion?
Um, in order to create a video walkthrough, uh, I mean, there's a whole bunch of photogrammetry software out there. Reality capture's more or less free at the moment, but uh, nothing comes to mind. I'm sure there is one.
I guess it was just yeah, asking for a suggestion friendly, since you shared a lot, and thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Otto, for this fantastic presentation. And apart from the questions, we have a lot of congratulating comments. So that's fantastic. So I will introduce the next lecture, which will be presented by Hayley Ramos and Andre Jauregui, titled Reconstructing the Past Through Immersive Experiences. They will explore how the digital reconstruction of historic sites plays a vital role in their preservation, drawing on dissemination projects aimed at retracing everyday's life within its historical context. As founders of SOE Studio, based in New York, They specialize in a range of 3D scanning techniques, as well as augmented and virtual reality. And they also share their expertise through the visualization techniques course at GSEP, Columbia University. And I will now leave the floor to them. So hi, Haley. Hi, Andre.
Hey, Blanca.
Hello.
Yeah, thank you, Factum Foundation and Archive for allowing us to speak today about our work. Our talk today is titled Reconstructing the Past Through Immersive Experiences, and we'll be running you through some of our work today.
Yeah, just as Haley said, thank you so much for joining us. Morning for us, afternoon for you all. It's a pleasure to talk about historic preservation and cultural heritage, especially before our country places a tariff on it. That's a bad joke, but essentially what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about our work. Now, we're a New York City-based technology studio focused on the preservation of buildings and artifacts. And really, what we're aiming to do is deploy the latest digital technologies to 3D scan, model, and design objects at all scales. So we work from the architectural scale down to the small artifact scale. So my name is Andre Paul Howdy. I'm co-founder of SOE Studio. So I'm a trained architect. Outside of my role with SOE Studio, I'm actually a VDC director, which is a virtual design and construction director that works primarily with implementation of digital twins for enterprise companies like Amazon, Google. And why that's interesting is because I'm able to kind of get a bird's eye view of what other companies are using and try to use that technology to inject it into the cultural heritage sphere. So I look at my role as kind of working with 1 foot in tech and 1 foot into historic preservation, high resolution 3D scanning, particularly with a focus on digital conservation. So my background is a trained architect, and my graduate studies were done in historic preservation with a focus on digital scanning.
Yeah, and I'm also a historic preservationist. Andre and I studied together, and I'm also an environmental planner, and I became interested in 3D scanning through my passion for photography.
So Haley and I founded SOE Studio because in the United States, historic preservation is a bit of a sleepy field, right? We noticed that there's a lot of very underrepresented sites in the United States, lack of funding, lack of tools. And so during our field work in graduate school, we were working at the invitation of the Queen of Jordan and Petra and hiking through Amman, Jordan. And during that trip, we had a lot of conversations about, the future of preservation. And we came up with this idea instead of trying to get jobs when we graduated in traditional preservation outfits, that we would start our own firm. Our name, Special Operations Executives, is a bit of a play on the British Secret Service during World War II, which if you watch any of the James Bond movies, that's essentially where they got the idea for James Bond from SOE in the 1930s. And so our idea was that we were going to act like Agent Q in those movies and provide all these interesting and valuable tools, technological approaches into traditional historic preservation practice. As we said, we're based in New York City. We founded our studio at the end of about 2017. And to date, we have about 70 projects on the books. We try to take anywhere from 7 to 10 projects a year. And that's because we're really trying to focus on giving attention where it's due. You'll see that a common thread throughout all of our work is that it's really focused on cultural heritage. So anything we do is something that we deem culturally valuable. And that's one of the barometers that we use to test before we take on a project. And today you're going to see some work that is maybe more traditional and also more experimental. So we're going to try to cover, we've selected about 7 projects that we're going to show today that we'll try to cover the full spectrum of what our studio does. So a little bit of history here. We actually go back to 2018 where we did training at Factum. So it's wonderful to see Otto. For us, giving a presentation alongside Factum is kind of going full circle because a lot of where we are today, we have to, we have to give credit where credit's due. Adam Lowe at Factum Foundation gave us the opportunity to study in Spain. So we did live in Spain for a very brief moment. And we learned so much about, experimental approaches and the ethos that Factum Foundation brings to the cultural heritage sector. And so in a past life, this was me. Haley and I worked on Powhatan's mantle. So what you're looking at here is actually Pocahontas's father's robe. And I believe it was King George where they actually gifted each other. So a mantle is the robe that a king wears over his shoulders. So they actually traded mantles. And so one of them is at the oldest museum in the world in Oxford, the Ashmolean. And so we were invited to participate and train alongside them to create a high resolution photogrammetric model of that piece. So we just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, and then we were first introduced to the Cheney Foundation in 2018 as part of Columbia University's Advanced Preservation Technology Studio. And we traveled to Venice and we carried out intensive field work at the Cheney Foundation as well as St. Mark's Basilica. What you're looking at is a high resolution photogrammetry model of a ceiling at the Cheney Foundation. And then when we returned to New York City, we processed the models into CNC prototypes and elevated reliefs, which we exhibited at the university. And now Andre and I are back at Columbia, but in our capacity as professors. And this is an example of a 3D model, 3D print that one of our students created last fall.
Yeah, and so our mission is to preserve and reimagine historic objects and spaces by uniting traditional conservation with advanced digital technologies. So the courses that we do teach at Columbia are all focused on advanced visualization techniques. And it's really exciting for us to be able to teach and give back to the next generation, especially as Otto said, all these new technologies, Gaussian splatting, for instance, is really changing the way things have been done. So it's an opportunity for us to engage with our students. And what you're looking at here is one of our students who, prior to working with photogrammetry, prior to working with architectural drafting, I believe they were actually a history major, was able to, in a very short time, understand how 3D scanning can be used for archival purposes and for representational purposes. And they just, the students continually surprise us with their ability to work with cultural heritage objects through the lens of 3D scanning and rendering. Yeah. So our studio has 5 main veins of work. And so we look at 3D scanning as being a very valuable tool because it can be used in so many different ways. It's really the Swiss Army knife of digital technology in our view. So it comes to us from reverse engineering. But as I said, with historic preservation at the center of our studio, we look at these 5 particular stars. So analysis having to do with academic research is one way we can use these 3D scans. Interpretation through visual graphics or artistic renderings. Monitoring. Preservationists are very focused on securing architectural relics, so there's lots of monitoring that takes place. So long-term monitoring, conditions assessments, conditions reports. Digital scans can also be used for just restoration purposes. So in a lot of ways, we can make a lot of manipulations before we ever touch the physical object itself. So that's more of a conservation vein, or just providing visual aids to get things through government agencies, regulatory agencies. Reconstruction, which is something I'm very passionate about. So depending on the resolution of the scans, we can use that for G-code for fabrication, whether that's CNC routing, additive manufacturing, etc. And artifact replacement, which we called the Dutchman. So if ever there's an issue where a piece is missing, it's something that we can really apply our tools to replicate things. And again, academic research analysis is really at the core of just about all of these. So we can start there. So we're going to show you some projects from each of these 5 veins.
Yeah, so I wanted to share just one last project that we did in collaboration with Archive. And after grad school, I returned to the Cheney Foundation with support from a Columbia grant. And this project explored the long-term impact of restoration on architecture. And this project was inspired by John Ruskin, who is an architectural historian from the 19th century. His idea of the golden state of time, which is the belief that a building's beauty lies in the visible marks of age. And we focused on Ruskin's daguerreotypes of Venice, which he created to protest restorations that he saw as erasing historical authenticity. And by revisiting these sites that Ruskin once photographed through daguerreotypes, we extended his mission of watching old buildings with anxious care and examined how his ideals resonate with current preservation practices. So what you're looking on the screen is one of his daguerreotypes from 1845, and then a resulting 3D model from our photogrammetry work. This was a column at the Palazzo Ducale in Venice. As preservationists, we're constantly looking to the past to inform how we approach the present. This is a photo from when we visited the National Archives in Washington, D.C., where we conducted research and gathered documentation on American embassies that were built during the Cold War. We sifted through thousands of negatives and microfiche and other documents to digitize, which were eventually published in a book that was done by our colleague, David Peterson. The book is titled U.S. Embassies of the Cold War, and this book explores 14 mid-century modern American embassies that were designed not just for their function, but also as symbols of democratic ideals during a very tense geopolitical era. They were built to be this billboard of democracy, which was a sharp contrast to the neoclassicism associated with fascism and communism. And this blend of the past and the present of archival research and digital preservation is really central to how we approach our work.
And so traditionally, historic preservation has been more focused on the built environment, but as we progress, we find that advocacy is very important. If you think about a lot of buildings, architecture that's getting removed and destroyed, a lot of it is because they don't have advocates, or they're not promoting the history of space. So, there's many ways we can do that. Haley and I have worked with VFX before, film and TV. And the way we think about it is the more we can promote cultural heritage, time period, understanding, I guess, the stories that took place, that can also help save buildings and architecture. So this was a TV show that I worked on in partnership with Apple TV, was a historic consultant. And so a lot of my work had to do with researching 1850s architecture, interior design work, and working with the directors in the art department to represent that in a truthful way historically. So there's a couple slides here if you want to go to the next slide, Haley. And so something that's really interesting is the stories behind each and every piece in this scene. From the wallpaper, which we had to understand how it was done, hand-carved wood pieces were placed with paint and stacked on top of each other in order to create this 1850s wallpaper, which is true to the colors that would have been available at the time. So we had to research Emily Dickinson's family, understand their income stream, let that guide the interior design, and also down to the paper. The paper that was represented in this television show is accurate color. Believe it or not, there was a paper shortage due to several global conflicts at the time, and they were digging up mummies across Egypt and actually using paper, which sounds crazy, from all the mummies that they were excavating in ancient Egypt, and actually shipping that to Northeast America at that time. So just interesting facts like that are great to promote cultural heritage aspects of this time period and the interior design of the 1850s. But yeah, so now we're going to go a little bit into interpretation. So 3D scanning is a valuable tool, but we also work with other tools. What you're looking at here is X-ray thermography. So we were asked to assist some artists who were working on rehabilitation of the United Nations building. And so during this rehabilitation, a lot of technological tools were embedded in 1960s architectural elements. So for instance, the ashtrays and the armrests were removed and translators were placed inside of these armrests. So we worked with the artist to bring an X-ray to site, to X-ray certain architectural elements that would be presented at the inaugural Open Shed exhibition here in New York City. And so what you're looking at here is an X-ray machine that's traditionally used for horses and for people who cannot get out of bed. So it's a mobile system that we had to work with a partner who was certified to use X-ray thermography on certain sites, and lots of coordination. As far as we know, this is the only photogrammetric and X-ray scan ever done of the United Nations Security Council. And the security, again, was so difficult for this site. So it's one of our favorite projects, certainly one of mine. And so this was the final result. It was presented, and a publication was also made by Farzan Loftigem and Caitlin Blanchett. And the way we displayed this was the way a doctor would display a broken bone, right? So we use that same visual identity to kind of translate and, I guess, represent these digital scans that we were able to take on site. And so another vein of our work is monitoring. So creating long-term, short-term, and conditions assessment reports. And so in addition to our baseline scanning, we also have done microscopy to identify potential wood typologies, etc. So the next project we're going to present is, oh, actually, I got ahead of myself. You want to take this one, Haley? Sorry.
Sure. Yeah, so as Andre was saying, we use 3D scanning for monitoring and historic preservation. This non-invasive method allows us to capture details, especially of hard to reach places. This is a church here in New York City, and it allows us to assess condition, plan conservation, and track changes over time. And it also allows us to create a lasting digital record for future preservation efforts. So what you're looking at here is Grace Church in New York City. It's a historic church that was built between 1846 and 1847 by a prolific American architect, James Renwick Jr. And this is the interior. So we conducted is it showing you? Sorry.
It's showing. We can see it.
Okay, I can't see it on my end, sorry. So we conducted an exterior drone inspection of Grace Church's rose window to assess the condition of the assembly. And what you're looking at here is just a video we captured of the steeple and the rose window. So we could see all of the tracery surrounding masonry and joints of the window. The rose window here was located about 50 feet above the ground, which is about 20 meters or so. So it was impossible to access without a drone or specialized lift equipment. Almost to the rose window. So in addition to capturing this video, we conducted 3D scanning and photogrammetry. And what you're looking at here is the resulting orthographic projection from the 3D model. And from this projection, we were able to create as-built drawings, which gave us precise measurement information. And we were able to also draw in all of the detail from the tracery as well. And this allowed us to create annotated sketches and better understand the condition of each of the stained glass elements. And we were able to create a labeling system so that we could develop a report and deliver to the parish so that they could consider conservation treatments.
And so, yeah, I would just add, our process really speeds things up. So if you look at how you would traditionally collect this type of data set, once we have that orthographic projection, we could just run an automation, just a basic live trace. And what that does is that gives us a tracery line drawing. And from there, we can use that as a baseline for a conditions assessment. So if you would look, this would traditionally take somebody, weeks and weeks and weeks to build scaffolding, to go up, to take measurements, to take individual pictures of each tracery area. But with our methods, it's much faster. And how that translates to the client and to the stakeholder is it just reduces pricing. So the more we can reduce pricing, it still aids in our mission of trying to preserve these sites, because then that money can then be used on different areas of the church and not on, doing something that we can easily automate. And maybe older preservation firms are just unaware of those processes. And so to kind of piggyback off of the monitoring, digital restoration is something that we're very passionate about. So once we create photogrammetric scans, white light scans, whatever, I guess, detail that we're looking for, we can then use that as a baseline to begin working with that 3D asset. So we're going to present some sculptural pieces that we worked on in coordination with a beautiful garden in Miami.
Yeah, so as Andre mentioned, this was a digital restoration project that we completed in collaboration with Vizcaya Gardens, which is in Miami, Florida. Here are some photographs of the gardens. Back in 1920, Gaston Lachey was commissioned to sculpt a pair of peacocks for the Peacock Bridge, which links the estate's formal gardens to the more natural lagoon gardens. And over the years, Miami's tough climate and multiple hurricanes took a toll on the Peacock Bridge, and the originals were eventually removed and stored here in New York City to protect them from further damage. So for this project, we aim to recreate Lachey's peacocks, blending 3D scanning with digital fabrication as well as hands-on craftsmanship. So we were brought in to conduct high-resolution 3D scanning of an original plaster cast, which was located here in New York City. And our goal was to capture all of the fine details. And since the cast did have some wear and damage, we had to carefully refine the model. What you're looking at here is a decimated version of the peacock, which we use just to quickly visualize our scan versus the high resolution version that we eventually sent off to be fabricated. And throughout the process, we worked with conservation experts and sculptors to strike the right balance between detail and what would actually translate well in the final cast stone medium. We used a combination of LiDAR scanning as well as photogrammetry. And what you're looking at here is Andre actually spraying the plaster cast with a dulling spray. This is a water-based spray that we use to reduce the reflectivity of objects whenever possible. Of course, we can't use this on many objects that are precious and sensitive, but in this case, we were able to apply this dulling coat, which was critical to our scanning process. So after we created the refined 3D model, this guided CNC milling, which allowed us to create an accurate prototype for mold making. And then these molds were used to create durable stone replicas built to handle Miami's tough climate. And it allowed us to stay true to the originals. And here you're looking at the reinstallation of the peacock.
This is very typical of anything cast stone. It just doesn't weather well. It's a cheaper option than obviously carving something out of granite or marble. So you see this a lot in the United States, especially for sculptural elements that are placed on the exterior. So it's important to note that while they did replace this with more cast stone, they do have that G code. They do have those 3D models now. So it's our hope that they hold on to that, right? And they can use that in perpetuity next time these begin to fall apart in another 50 years or so.
Yeah, and so, the traditional techniques were key to keeping this project true to the originals. The plaster cast that we scanned did have some damage to it. So it was a very fine line between staying true to an original versus doing some digital restoration to ensure that, these would match what was there originally. So in general, sorry.
No, you go ahead.
Okay. So in general, digital restoration becomes really complex when we're working with scans that are reflective or transparent. Reflective materials such as like a mirrored surface or polished metals create unpredictable light reflections that can distort scanning data, which make it really difficult to capture accurate geometry and textures. And you're looking at a sculpture that we scanned at the Asia Society and Museum here in New York City. And this was one of our first experiments with how to digitally restore and recreate such complex elements. So we were able to create like a baseline 3D scan from LiDAR data that then we pulled into other 3D modeling software, including Rhino, to remodel it and then reproject a mirrored textured surface onto it. And so since this was just going to be used for a virtual experience, this approach worked really well for us. And transparent surfaces like windows or the sculpture, which you're looking at here, can obscure the underlying structure and often leads to incomplete or missing data. And in these cases, specialized techniques such as multi-angle scanning, polarized light, and post-processing are required to capture these objects. And so these complexities require a combination of techniques to recreate and digitally restore such objects. And Andre can speak a bit about the method used for this element.
Yeah, so LiDAR and photogrammetry don't necessarily capture full detail, but remarkably, we do get edge detail for pieces like this. What I like about the way we approach projects is, so the client for this was creating a bit of a 3D tour, but in order to place the objects within the 3D tour, we do have to scan them. So that gives us an opportunity to create an archive for them. And what I like about this project is to fill in that detail, we also created a grasshopper definition. So we use some code, and now we can also save that code in addition to those 3D scans. So when we archive data such as this, we have the raw scans, we have the raw images, and now we're also able to place a source code that defines that geometry in the form of a grasshopper definition. So you have 3 different means that people can hold on to in the event anything ever happens to this, or new ways of extracting value, right? We've seen NFTs, we've seen how people are playing with art, and so who knows, they might sell the source code as an NFT one day. But so kind of going around as preservation is giving the client what they want, but at the same time introducing them to archiving and how that can benefit long-term is one of our goals. And so we're very proud of that aspect of our work.
So many of our projects, we use 3D scanning to bridge the physical and digital realms. And in some cases, we apply these tools to physically restore and reconstruct historic buildings and sites. This was a project we did in Darien, Connecticut at the Henry David Weed Home, which is an 1870s Victorian house. As you can see in the image here, half of the wooden gable barge board deteriorated and fell off, leaving the structure kind of in this disrepaired state. And we ended up conducting a hands-on conditions assessment using a 50-foot boom lift. And we found that most of the wood was extensively rotted, which required the complete replacement of the entire assembly. You can see here just how bad the wood was in, bad of a condition the wood was in. And so we took a sample of the wood and conducted wood microscopy, and we identified that this was originally Eastern white pine, which is, or it was considered an old growth wood in the 19th century. However, now Eastern white pine is considered new growth wood and it lacks longevity. So we had to evaluate alternative wood types to reconstruct the barge board. And we conducted 3D scanning of the barge board, and we use these to create plans for its reconstruction. What you're looking at is a restored drawing of the barge board. So essentially what we did is just reflected one side of it so that we could provide a carpenter with a complete version for their fabrication. And we also scanned the entire facade of the house so that we could create these as-built drawings, which would help aid in the planning of the construction and installation process, since it ended up being quite more complex than we initially thought it would be. And so part of the fabrication process also involved using a CNC mill to create the lattice work, which you can see on the screen here. However, most of the work was completed using traditional woodworking techniques such as hand-cut joinery and detailed carving. So 3D scanning and fabrication technology helped us streamline the reconstruction process because it provided us with precise measurement information that we were able to use as templates. But ultimately, these tools couldn't replace the traditional methods and the skilled trades needed to restore the historic details. And here are some photos of the barge board just as it was being installed. So in terms of interpretation, a lot of our 3D scanning work is focused on understanding sites in more detail and giving the public access to these models and this understanding. This was a project that we did in 2020 in collaboration with the Noguchi Foundation. So we documented the ceiling and waterfall, which is located here at 666 Fifth Avenue, which is right across the street from the Museum of Modern Art. So a developer acquired the property and they were planning to renovate the lobby, which would require the removal of these installations. And despite advocacy efforts by the Noguchi Foundation, they had to remove it and ultimately decided to give both of these installations to the museum. And we were contracted by the foundation to perform scanning and documentation of the artworks to facilitate their disassembly and cataloging.
It's a common thread that we work in this gray area because developers are the #1 reason for buildings being demolished and historic spaces being removed. And so what we've learned in the last, I guess, 9 years of being in business is that in many cases, they'll come to an agreement where the developer will offer to pay to archive the space or move the space. And so the entity or organization that's trying to save it will often reach out to us. So we work kind of in between that space between two clients that have, I guess, agreed to a certain amount of funds. So it's a great opportunity for us. It's a perfect example of a success story. These louvers were going to be removed and just thrown in the heap. And there wasn't too much thought about it until the Noguchi Foundation stepped in and contacted us. But sorry to interrupt, Haley.
No, thank you, Andre, for adding that. So here we conducted 360 photography, just using Matterport, and we also conducted laser scanning and photogrammetry so that we could create accurate as-built drawings and create a record of the artworks in situ. So we mapped out all of the 114 louvers in their original position. So this was over 6,000 square feet. Sorry, I don't know what that is in square meters. And Noguchi referred to this as his landscape of clouds. And from here, we developed a roster of all the louvers as well as a labeling system so that the archivist could disassemble them and effectively catalog and store them in a systematic way so that they could be reinstalled. And it did take several years, but eventually the Noguchi Foundation reinstalled them at a gallery in London, and they were the centerpiece of an exhibition titled A New Nature in 2022. And you're looking at the installed artwork here. These are the ceiling louvers, and this was the sculptural waterfall. So I want to share a project because because it's at a site that is very dear to us and Factum Foundation as well. It's what you're looking at behind me in my background. So I was first introduced to the site of San Barello during my master's thesis work at Columbia, and actually Carlos from Factum Foundation was my thesis advisor. The San Barilio Hermitage is an 11th century site that's located in a remote part of northern Spain. You're looking at some 19th century silver gelatin prints of the site. It was once covered with iconographic wall paintings, which covered the walls, and then they were later removed by an art dealer, where they were transferred onto canvas and sold to museums around the world. Some of these paintings are located here in New York City at the Met Cloisters, as well as the Museo del Prado in Madrid, as well as others in the US. And so in my thesis, I developed a augmented reality prototype application that virtually restores the original paintings to their intended locations, since physically returning them is no longer possible. We use high resolution scans produced by Factum Foundation of the paintings that are now at the Met and overlaid the imagery onto the surviving remains of the Hermitage. And this process allowed us to offer visitors a more immersive experience of the site, how it once appeared prior to the removal of the paintings in the 20th century. And this is a site that we've remained involved with in various capacities over the years. Actually, in 2023, Andre and I returned to San Barilio to digitally document the Hermitage as part of ongoing conservation and monitoring efforts. And this is Andre conducting some photogrammetry. It was quite the complex site to scan. It's very remote. There's no electricity at the site, so we had to bring in a generator and rent some lighting equipment in order to accurately light the space. And this is one of the biggest considerations we have in our scanning work is how we can light and capture all of the details in these spaces. And of course, it's much easier when we're in a gallery space like what you're looking at here, where we have access to electricity and we can use various lighting rigs. We've been experimenting a lot with using ring flashes in our workflow. So that's what you're looking at here on the left. And then, just using smaller standard standing lights, which are more easily transportable than the larger lights, which we just saw. And so this is the resulting scan from our work. We were able to use laser scanning as well, and this really reduced the time required for on-site monitoring. And this high-resolution record will provide them with a baseline for future monitoring efforts. So this was a project that we conducted at the Robert E. Lee Memorial in Richmond, Virginia. You're looking at the resulting 3D model of the memorial as it appeared in 2020 during the Black Lives Matter protests prior to the memorial's removal and relocation to a museum.
Yeah, and so our kit, for the most part, is pretty sparse. It's important to note that it's just Haley and I in our studio, and we really keep it that way because cross-disciplinary partnerships are very important to us. All of our projects are very specific in their needs, so it's not uncommon for us to build a certain team depending on which projects we're working on. The Robert E. Lee Memorial that you just saw on the last slide is important to us because it really exemplifies this idea of rogue scanning, where there's a lot of preservation efforts that take place behind closed doors or in institutions. But sometimes it's important to get out into the field and just do scans that maybe you have to ask for forgiveness instead of permission. That scan was actually completed during protest time. So, there were specific areas that we would have to capture when people were not standing in the way. And shortly after this site was removed, disassembled. And so without our efforts, without being there, we wouldn't have had the opportunity to record this. We think that, documenting sites, especially in times of unrest, is very valuable for the historical record. And it's important to note that there was no client for this. This was something that we felt was important, to document. And since then, we've actually had people reach out for this model. They want access to it, they want to study it, etc. So this is just a rough plan. So for the most part, before we go to any site, there's quite a bit of planning that takes place, especially if it's covert. So since we don't have permitting for this, this was something that we had to be very cognizant of how much time we're taking on site. So we go with the minimum viable, I guess, option. So we're always trying to scan as fast as we can. That's a common thread through our work, whether you're working at a world institution such as the Met, where they only give you a certain amount of time, or you're working in the middle of the night because nobody's there, or you're trying to avoid police officers, or you're trying to avoid, bad weather. We have to be very cognizant about how we approach sites. So what you're looking at here is what I call just a rough photogrammetric flight plan. Colors are generally arranged by either hardware or timings, and pink dots are just the scans that we need. That's the minimum viable amount of LiDAR scans we need to take in order to get a usable model at the resolution we'd like it to be at.
Yeah, so for that project, we use a combination of LiDAR scanning, photogrammetry from the ground, as well as drone photogrammetry. And what you're looking at here is the processed aligned point cloud. You can see where we have our network of photographs from the drone above, as well as the scans from the ground. And then we process this point cloud into a 3D mesh, and we texture this 3D mesh using our high resolution photographs, and we're able to produce the 3D model that you're looking at here, which we rendered.
Again, this is just an example of the amount of planning that goes into our work. We have to present this to certain stakeholders so they understand timing and what the process looks like. This diagram was made to scan the 9/11 Museum and Memorial. So on the left hand, you see the last column, which was the last column standing after the 9/11, I guess, catastrophe, an attack. And the right is just a rough diagrammatic of how to scan a fire truck that was, again, one of the last, I guess, artifacts left on site after the destruction at the 9/11 site.
Yeah, and what's so interesting about this site here is that these objects were much larger than we're used to scanning in a gallery environment. So this column that you're looking at here is about 40 feet tall. So we had to use I think it was about a 35-foot scissor lift to get high enough so that we could capture the top of the object here. So this is Andre using the scissor lift. So as we've kind of touched on earlier, it's really important for us to consider a lighting strategy before going on site. So for this project, this was for a production company, Revelations, which is owned by Morgan Freeman. And so we were digitizing these objects for some of their productions. And so it was really important to capture these in an environment that reflected all of the details of the objects themselves. So for this project, we rented about 6 standing lights, and these are typically used on movie sets. And we were able to light this fire truck here. And this was an extremely complex object to scan because of the amount of reflectivity and the complexities of the form with all of these, entanglements of metal. And this is the resulting 3D model from our scanning. Here we used a combination of LiDAR and photogrammetry.
Yeah, for those of you who are familiar with photogrammetric processes, what did this take, Haley? 3 weeks straight? 2 weeks straight to process? Just letting the computers run at full blast to get this quality. So it was a very, very lengthy process for us.
Andre, do you want to speak to this, or should we skip? I know we're short on time. Maybe we should get to our last few projects.
Yeah, we can skip we can skip around. This was just to talk about, I can speak over this, just the amount of work that goes behind the 3D assets. There's an entire pipeline that we're always perfecting. As Otto said, Gaussian splats are really big right now, understanding the benefits. So we're always looking at data cleaning, surface reconstruction, registration, ways we can speed up texturing. But yeah, it's just, it's essentially an iceberg where the final product is just what you're seeing at the tip, but there's a lot that goes in, and our preservation background gives us a really strong moral direction when it comes to how we work with artifacts, which is much different. You'll see that there's tons of 3D scanning firms in the world. Most of them are focused on engineering and construction, reverse engineering. But when we work with objects, we have to work at a completely different level because we're working with that historic preservation mindset where we're trying to do the least amount of damage and be crystal clear about any alterations we're making, because anything we do can be misconstrued in the future as historic record. So that's something you'll see. We're always making decisions based on this, I guess, moral direction of trying to keep as much of the historical record as possible. What you're looking at here is Albert Einstein's house in Princeton. We just wanted to show some of the rendering processes, but I think we're short on time, so we can probably skip forward a little bit. So culminating all of the work we do to create digital assets to the level that we're happy with, archival quality is what we call them, digital assets, monitoring, analysis, reconstruction, interpretation, all of those culminate in an interactive experience. So we've been fortunate enough to have several clients who kind of are looking for interactive experiences, whether that be tours or new applications of on-site apps. But we're always thinking about how do we use these digital assets in a way that gets the most use. A word that is also thrown around is democratization. We're always trying to make sure that people are gaining access and having the ability to work with these spaces, to be in the spaces digitally. What we don't want is to go through all of this work and have our digital asset just live on a computer and not get used, right? So with the next two projects we're going to show are really a culmination of what it looks like when we do all of these methodologies and have a really cohesive output that shows off all of the work and the research and the time we put into our projects.
Yeah, as Andre said, we've been exploring immersive digital experiences in a much deeper way in our recent work. Actually, one of our first experiments in this space was a collaboration with the National Trust for Historic Preservation at Philip Johnson's Glass House in New Canaan, Connecticut, which you're looking at here. This was back in 2018 when virtual tours and immersive storytelling were relatively new and largely untapped in the field of preservation. So we scanned the entire property using LiDAR and photogrammetry. We also scanned objects on the site, including many from Johnson's personal collection. And by combining 3D models, architectural scans, and high-resolution recordings of the artwork, we were able to create an immersive tour experience that brings the site to life in a new way. And this is the digital experience here. So users were able to investigate high-resolution panoramic photography that was conducted of artwork, as well as view 3D models that we scanned using photogrammetry. And this was combined with audio that would narrate. And so this was really one of our first explorations into this world of virtual tours. And the next project I want to share with you is a partnership with the Tenement Museum here in New York City. The Tenement Museum is a nonprofit cultural institution that brings to life the homes of immigrants, migrants, and refugees and offers a window into their stories. And so we've been working with the Tenement Museum to scan their exhibits at 97 Orchard Street since 2021. We were looking at just an exterior scan that we made. This was done very quickly for a project in 2021 that we did with the Washington Post. And the result was an interactive 3D model of the tenement museum that used photogrammetry and LiDAR to digitize the museum's exhibits and offers readers a virtual tour of the historic building and traces the evolution of housing conditions from 1863 to 1935. So it's a web scroll animated tour, which you can view today. And after the Washington Post project, the museum found that this project was so successful that they invited us back to continue our scanning efforts, not only for their internal documentation, but also with the goal of using the models to support virtual education initiatives. And so over the span of 2 years, we've scanned all of their exhibits, and you're looking at a fly-through animation showing one of the resulting 3D models from our scanning, which is called the Gumpert's apartment. And so here we used a lot of the lighting equipment that we shared earlier, as well as LiDAR and photogrammetry, which is a common theme throughout all of our projects. And so following this project, we were brought on by the museum to develop a virtual visitation platform for the museum. At the time, their educators were relying on Sketchfab and PowerPoints to conduct these. And so the goal with this project was to unify all these assets into a single cohesive platform. And this is the result, which allows visitors and students to explore the historic museum and learn about all of the different stories about the families that live there. And so with this project, we are able to go inside these apartments and move through them in real time and investigate objects which are embedded into the experience here. And this is combined with other media such as images and photographs, which help tell the story. And all of this is led by a museum educator. So it's really kind of a simple platform in terms of not having a lot of audio narration and written text. And you can navigate through the various chapters and learn more.
Yeah, it's interesting. So we created a 3D model, which they used because the entire site was undergoing renovation. So while it was closed, they were still able to give virtual tours. And during that process, I think they understood the value that virtual tours could provide. And so they asked for a much more comprehensive approach, which is to build out the website that you just saw.
Yeah, and so a final project that we're going to share today is a collaboration we did with the International Committee of the Red Cross. It's titled Broken Cities, and this was an immersive experience that brings together their expertise in humanitarian law and conflict zones with our work in 3D scanning. And so this experience uses photogrammetry to document and preserve sites that have been impacted by warfare. So the experience features 3D models of a hospital in Mosul, Aleppo's Old Souk, and the Al-Mana Tower in Gaza, each which were created from tens of thousands of photographs captured by our ICRC field teams that we trained during the summer of 2022.
So ICRC is International Committee of the Red Cross, and this was a new, I guess, project for us in the sense that we weren't allowed for security reasons to visit a lot of these war zones. So a lot of our work was managing teams and training them virtually. So there was a lot of, I guess, coordination that took place in different time zones.
And just to add, a lot of them, the teams that we trained had zero experience in scanning. So we gave them training in photogrammetry because they didn't have access to laser scanning equipment. A lot of them would go and take recordings of these spaces and send them back to us so that we could create 3D models like what you're looking at here and mock-up diagrams, instructing them exactly how to take the photographs. In the case of Gaza, they were able to visit a building department and find plans of the apartment and label them for us so that we could recreate all of these spaces as you're looking at here. And these were extremely complex and harsh environments to scan, especially in the case of Mosul. And so you know, it was really impressive that they were able to document all of these spaces using drones and handheld cameras. And then they would send all of the data to Geneva, to the ICRC headquarters, who would then forward them to us. And Andre and I processed all of this data. I think we had about 10 models in total. This is just another example of some of the diagrams and documentation that we provided the team so that they could conduct their scanning.
Yeah, with the language barriers, you know, we had to go full diagrammatic. So if you can imagine creating IKEA style diagrams to assist people who may have never done photogrammetry before. But the people we worked with were very brave, and you know, they took risks because they wanted to tell their story. They wanted to explain through documentation what's happened to their communities. It's important to note, and very heart-wrenching, that the team that we worked with in Gaza, we have not heard from them since the start of the war. You know, these war zones are still active, as you can see in the news, but it's very important to work with community stakeholders that actually have, you know, real interest in keeping a record and training them through diagrammatics. We hope to do more in this sphere of training teams using diagrammatics, because we think there's something there, especially as technology becomes easier to use.
Yeah, and what's so important is that we're giving all of these individuals in these places the tools to do this work themselves, which Andre and I think is really important to the field. So yeah, feel free to check out that project. It's titled Broken Cities ICRC. And that concludes our presentation for today. We're always looking for new collaborators, so please feel free to reach out to us.
Yeah, thank you for your time. We appreciate you joining.
Thank you very much, Heli and Andre. And well, thank you for everybody listening. It was very interesting. I invite the participant to ask some question in the chat or raising your hands. We are quite tight with the timing, but if there is a question or two, of course we can answer. In the meantime, how do you see your work changing in the future?
Yeah, so Andre and I really want to keep developing our work in the space of immersive tours and digital experiences. As Andre was saying, we think it's really important that these 3D models we're creating have a life beyond just the archive. And so having the possibility to create these experiences to share with a wider audience and the public is really important to us. And that's really where we see a lot of our future development as a studio.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, trying to mine other industries for their tools and trying to continue to apply that to cultural heritage is one of our guiding, I guess, principles. So you're going to see more and more with artificial intelligence. It's kind of hard to avoid that it's invading all sectors. So it's going to be interesting to see that interplay between how artificial intelligence is going to affect our work. I think verification is going to be very important moving forward, since there's going to be a deluge of flood of digital assets in the future. Understanding how digital assets are made, confirmed, validated is going to be very important moving forward. But for our studio, just continuing to understand the landscape and assist preservation in any way we can is very important for us. And I think Haley and I have seen the value of virtual tours. And I think we're going to lean much heavier into virtual tours and see how that can impact the space as well.
Great. I see there are some messages. Yeah, from the British Museum asking about, yeah, it is not a question, I think more an appreciation comment, like that he was curious about the Tenement Museum project and the engagement impact he had. Do you have already some data and responses?
Well, we've gotten great feedback from the docents at the museum. So what we've heard is that it's being used Primarily, it's mainly being used for school tours for smaller children. But since it's just now going live with the second phase, which is this beautiful website that is much more, I guess, clear and better models, we're going to see actual metrics from the engagement. But we've heard good things. We don't have exact numbers, but based on the fact that they're charging people to view this and making money from it for a year now, and it hasn't even been the final product that we're launching now. It's good news from them, and they're continuing to want to move forward with, I guess, more editions of that virtual tour. So we've seen engagement. It seems that to have had a really good impact, and we highly recommend you visit the Tenement Museum when you come. It's one of the great treasures in the Lower East Side.
Well, I think we can conclude for today, and thank you again. And this, one of the last things you said about discovering tool methodologies and techniques from different fields, could be science, and it's of course very important, and also the the multi-skilled necessity is of course is key. And also tomorrow, for the second part, the session 3 and 4, well, we will see again different people with different skills and teams with multiple skills, from historians to programmers, building up in the case of tomorrow's lessons, video games content based on cultural heritage data and sources. So yeah, this is very important for us too. For everybody, anyone connected today who knows Factum Foundation probably noticed lots of connections with your studio, and you explain it also very well why at the beginning. And Naomi asked, will it be possible to see the recording? Yes, the recording of this session and the next, as every Archive Online Academy course and talk are recorded and it's possible to view them on the archive website. And well, thank you very much again, and it has been great to listen to you, and see you tomorrow.